ตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening to you all. This is a time when the Sangha is on retreat, the Vasa time. So we are practicing more in solitude. The Buddha's word for solitude is viveka. Means solitude, seclusion. So physical seclusion is something that we practice to help us in training the mind, to see and know our own mind, become more aware of it, and also to reduce some of the disturbances that come about, say if you live in an urban area where there's a lot more people, noise, activity. So living in solitude reduces disturbances, brings simplicity to your life if you're living in a quiet place like a forest or a mountain top or a cave or somewhere. And this all supports the practice. With less disturbances, more simplicity, then your attention can be turned towards developing the qualities of the Dhamma that help us to improve our mind, strengthen it, bring up more skillful qualities based in mindfulness, wisdom and understanding. So the Buddha said physical seclusion, what we call Kaya Viveka, is a support for the arising of Citta Viveka, seclusion of the mind. It particularly means the seclusion or independence from the five hindrances. So Citta Viveka is synonymous with development of samadhi, one-pointed states of mind, where the mind is free from the five hindrances. It's not yet nibbana, but it's an important step that brings your mind closer to nibbana. And it's that experience of internal seclusion. Even if the world is disturbed on the outside, or there's earthquakes, or there's whatever else may be disturbing to human beings, if you develop some inner seclusion, Citta Viveka, then it doesn't matter so much. You have some inner peace to rely on, brings a steadiness to your mind, and you're not so easily affected by pleasant or unpleasant sense contact. The ultimate goal of the practice is upati viveka, the mind that is free from the mental defilements rooted in greed, anger, delusion, which cause suffering. So upati viveka means nibbana. So one who has attained nibbana has attained true, real seclusion from the defilements and from the causes of suffering, craving, attachment. They no longer are bothered by them, so they have complete freedom, complete peace, complete happiness wherever they go, whether they're busy or not. Like Ajahn Chah used to say, whether he's on his own or in a group, the mind stays the same, peaceful. So learning to appreciate seclusion, solitude, at least for periods of time, is a useful part of the practice. But it's not the only part of the practice, and it's also not always possible. We have duties and responsibilities in life. If you're in a monastery, you may still have other responsibilities that bring you out of seclusion, teaching, helping people, serving. If you're in the lay life, you may have family duties, responsibilities, relationships, you have work, and then social responsibilities, which bring you out. So you can't always get the seclusion that you would like, maybe. People often dream of going on retreat, and they often achieve it. Take time off work, or when it's vacation time, or even just a weekend, go somewhere for a retreat. But it's not always possible, so we also have to learn how to practice in different situations. Which means we have to learn how to look after our mind, and particularly guide our thinking. Even if you achieve physical seclusion, you go off on a retreat, or you go hiking and camping into the bush, or you're in a quiet cave miles from anywhere with no need to come out of your cave. You've still got your own mind to deal with. And your mind can be your best friend or your worst enemy. And if we don't train it and guide it, then when you're in seclusion, you have a lot of time to think. If you don't have much awareness, mindfulness, or wisdom guiding your thinking, then you can think yourself into a lot of suffering. So some people find the more time they've got to think, the worse it becomes. They thought they were bad off working hard, busy, no time to rest, no time to think, but then they get their seclusion and their retreat time, and they're even worse because their mind is all over the place. We find when our mind is not well trained yet, then it tends to just jump from one thought to another, one idea to another, one emotion to another, happy then sad, angry then peaceful, excited then bored, and so on. So a big part of our practice is training this mind, and particularly training how to think skillfully, to use thought well, use it to help us to understand things better and develop better states of mind, more peace, more happiness. You're harnessing the power of thought and the ability to think for our own benefit. And this is a vital part of our practice, our training. One of the technical words they use for this, learning to think skillfully, or we say wisely reflect on things. The Pali word is yoniso manasikara. And the Buddha said this is one of the factors, it's vital, essential for anyone who wants to progress on their spiritual path to the end of suffering. You have to learn how to think skillfully, use thought wisely. Yoniso means like the origin root of the word is the source or the origin of something. Manasikara is finding the way or thinking in a way that gets you to see the truth or gets you back to the source of things. So yoniso manasikara, we translate it as something like wise reflection or giving wise consideration to different things. But the aim of it is to help us get to the truth, understand the truth of our experience, so that we can understand where suffering comes from and how to end it. So there's a purpose to it. You can see in this day and age it's even more important to train our mind in how to use thought and wisely reflect on things, because there's so much information coming our way now because of the rise of digital technology, social media and so on. And just because somebody sends you a text or a video doesn't mean to say it's true. Just because somebody expresses an opinion doesn't mean it's true. Yet we have to learn how to wisely reflect on our experience, what we hear, what we learn from external sources, and we have to reflect on it another time and bring it into our heart to see whether it's really true or not. And we have to train our minds to do this. They don't necessarily automatically think wisely. Particularly when we're not peaceful, our mind is prey to all kinds of emotions, worries, fears, biases, greed, desire, and so on. So it's a big part of the training. So at the beginning of our practice, the Buddha said the two most vital, most important factors are associating with the wise, good teachers, people who are what we call Kalyanamitta, good friends who give us good advice, who can be good examples in the practice. That could be Sangha or laity. And then Yoniso Manasikara, learning to reflect on the Dhamma that we hear or that we read wisely, paying attention to it, giving it good consideration. And that's something we have to practice. And you see, the more you practice mindfulness, well, the more that facilitates wise reflection, because it helps you to pay attention to whatever it is you're thinking or examining. If there's not much mindfulness, again, it's hard to pay attention to anything. So we don't learn the lessons we need to learn. We don't learn what is causing us suffering, where the dangers are in what we're doing, or even just what we're thinking, where the benefits are. If you can't pay attention, you can't really learn. So you get stuck in life. So it's a big part of the practice, learning to use thought and use wise reflection and develop it as a skill. Sometimes wise reflection is something that you just do very quickly. If as you practice, there are some lessons we do learn quickly. So obvious examples, something that's like fire. You learn that fire burns, hurts you very quickly. So it's not something you need to give a lot of time or reflection to. You just know if there's fire around, well, it's dangerous. Don't get close to it. If you can put it out, that's good. It doesn't need a lot of wise reflection to understand that. But then there's other things that we really need to consider over and over again in our lives. Particularly understanding about karma, cause and result, cause and effect. What is good karma, what is bad karma? What actions lead to happiness, what actions lead to suffering? That's something we need to keep looking at and considering. And we make karma through the thinking mind, the intentional thoughts we have, but then also through our speech, our actions. And we need to keep looking and learning from that. We're learning about the Four Noble Truths. What is suffering? The Buddha, as we just chanted, the Buddha said, you have to know suffering, comprehend suffering for what it is, and understand what is the cause of suffering and what is the way to end suffering. That often takes time, energy. But what facilitates it is training in wise reflection. So it's something the Buddha encouraged us to do over and over again in our practice. Sometimes our mind, especially when you're on retreat, you get to see your own mind more closely. All the different thoughts, views, opinions, the different moods and emotions coming up. Sometimes the mind is a bit like a whiteboard. So you use a whiteboard for keeping notes of things or teaching when they use it for teaching to write up theories or information. You know, if your whiteboard is full of information, at first, even though that information may be, most of it might be quite useful stuff, but if it's all written up there and gradually you add to it over and over again, after a while it becomes impossible to really read it and get benefit from it. There's just too much stuff on there. The sentences, if you've written sentences, or the figures and the symbols, maybe they all merge together if there's too much information. Our mind is a bit like that. You know, half the time in life we absorb so much information. When you come to look at your mind and try to understand it or use your mind to understand things, it's like there's just too much there. And every thought pops up, grabs your attention, and then your mind jumps onto another thought, another issue, another concept, and there's very little understanding is gained. You look at your mind because there's not much mindfulness and there's a lot of information there. The mind is just running around. So you don't feel very peaceful and you don't get much benefit from looking at your mind. You know, often in meditation it's like that, isn't it? It just seems to be one thought after another and you don't really know much at all from it at the end of your meditation period. So of course whiteboards are good because you can wipe everything off and start again. So the ideal in meditation is to keep developing mindfulness so that you can have periods where the mind does go quiet. And it's like cleaning the whiteboard. And then when you practice Yoniso Manasikara, bring up wise reflection, you're starting from a place of clarity. There's space there, and you introduce your wise reflections, can examine the truth of something, the truth of this body, truth of your moods and the mind, truth of different aspects of your life. We're starting to fill up the whiteboard, but because when there's mindfulness, there's this clarity and space, well then the whiteboard doesn't seem too clogged up with information and you can use it skillfully. When there's no mindfulness, it's just thoughts after thoughts after thought and just filling up the whiteboard. So there's just writing everywhere and you can't really get a lot out of it. So we have to practice both mindfulness and developing wise reflection. Train this. You see, the Buddha gave a lot of stories and examples how to do this all the way through his teachings. You know, if you read the suttas, the texts, you'll find different patterns, different ways the Buddha encouraged us to reflect wisely and develop that skill. You know, there's lots of times he would explain the human experience and teach us to analyze things, break things down into their different component factors, or to see the stream of cause and effect in our experience. So you're learning what leads to what in life. And if I'm feeling angry, where is it coming from? Well, it's coming from certain causes and conditions. So maybe unpleasant feelings arise and then the mind latches onto them and starts thinking negative thoughts about some issue and you end up angry. You know, the Buddha would give explanations of how things happen, how suffering arises, but also how to end it. So in the case of anger, when you get angry, usually it's because you're giving unwise attention to something you don't like. You keep thinking about it. And that's the opposite of Yoniso Manasikara. It's what we call Ayoniso Manasikara. Thinking without wisdom, without reason. So if something goes wrong in your life, you have some physical pain or some disappointment or somebody insults you or something, you know, often our first reaction is unwise reflection. We just put attention on that painful feeling, the unpleasant words, the unpleasant situation that's arisen, and we just think about that. Without Yoniso Manasikara, we just get caught up into it. So establishing mindfulness, maybe you bring up some wise reflection. You say, hold on, this is anger, I'm suffering. That might be your first insight, to recognize when you're angry, you're suffering, and then to investigate, look back, where's it come from? What's the cause of this? Oh, there was this painful experience, and now I'm holding on to it, thinking about it, reliving it, not forgetting it, not letting it go, and it's getting worse. That might be an example of wise reflection, where you're looking back to see what the cause of your suffering is. And the more mindful you are, and the more you train in doing that, well, the clearer the causal link from the start of whatever it was through to when you end up angry, it becomes a little bit clearer, and then you can understand what you must do to end that pattern or that habit of mind. So wise reflection helps us get to that point where we maybe can just let go of the anger, understand it for what it is. It's just a mood based on feelings and certain experiences, but it's something we can let go of because it's impermanent. It's just a string of thoughts and feelings that arise, pass away. Wise reflection can help us to see that and then free us from that particular suffering. You learn something from the experience. But if there's no wise reflection, well, often it just repeats itself over and over again. So the Buddha was encouraging us to train like this every day, not just in a meditation retreat or when you're on your own somewhere, but in any part of our daily life, to bring the mind to bear on our experience and reflect on it. Develop some understanding of what's going on, what is useful and beneficial in the things we do, what is counterproductive, what is harmful. And that's on every level, on the level of our speech, our actions, and then just on the level of our thoughts, our views and opinions that we hold on to. We have to learn to examine these things. One of the times the Buddha talked about this, the very first Jataka story the Buddha taught. The Jataka tales are like tales of the Buddha's previous lifetimes, because he could remember his past lives. So he'd use these memories and the stories associated with them to teach people the Dhamma. Sometimes they come across as fairy tales or like fables, Aesop's fables, that kind of thing, but they're still valuable. When the Buddha tells a story, it's just helping you to see how things work and how you can use your mind to understand things better. It's not so much that you have to believe or not believe the story, it's more there's lessons you can draw from it. It's like the very first time he ever talked about his past lives was to Anathapindika, the wealthy merchant who supported the Buddha so faithfully through his life and helped to build one of the most famous monasteries in Buddhism, the Jetavana monastery, which is still there in India. You can go and visit the site. And there was one occasion Anathapindika brought a large group, they say 500 people, but it just means a lot of people, to see the Buddha, friends of his, but they all were not Buddhists. They all had faith in other teachers, other traditions. And out of compassion, he wanted them to hear the Buddha, to learn a bit more about what the Buddha taught. So he brought them along, and the Buddha gave a very clear, good teaching, and they all gained faith in the Buddha and the path of practice. But then they went away and they didn't come back for like 8 months. So in those 8 months, they gradually fell back into their old beliefs, old habits, some of them which were not very good for them, activities which were harming them, but they drifted away from Buddhism. And so 8 months later, Anathapindika brought them back to the Buddha and had to admit, the Buddha asked, how's everyone doing? And Anathapindika said, well, actually everyone's kind of lost interest in their practice. They've become very heedless, complacent. They're not practicing what you previously taught them. So the Buddha had to teach them again. And this time he taught them about the importance of learning how to wisely reflect on experience. He said if we don't do that, it's very easy to become lost in life, become heedless, and follow ways that will only lead to our suffering and even to disaster. We have to keep coming back to training our mind, examining the Dhamma to understand the truth of particularly the Four Noble Truths. What is suffering? What is its cause? And what's the way out of suffering? That's something you have to keep coming back and doing over and over again. If we don't look for the truth and we don't seek out the truth, then what happens? Well, we tend to fall into false ways of thinking that only lead to suffering, false beliefs, opinions and views on things, and that leads to actions and activities that only lead to our suffering. So we have to keep looking or seeking the truth. And this is why the Buddha said we have to practice this yoniso manasikara, keep teaching ourselves to examine the truth and look for the cause of things, understand better where happiness comes from, where suffering comes from, and so on. And he used the occasion to talk about, it was the first time he talked about his previous lives. So he said, well, there's this, in one life he was a merchant living in the city of Varanasi, and he was quite a well-to-do merchant, and the way he got his money was taking goods from Varanasi to another city, but he'd have to travel through the wilderness, the bush, the desert, which had its own obstacles. So whenever he travelled to sell in the next city, he'd always have to plan it well, think wisely how to do it, because there were so many obstacles. He said on one occasion there was another merchant who was equally wealthy but maybe not so smart, but this other merchant wanted to travel at the same time. And they say each of them had 500 ox carts full of goods to sell. But if they had both gone at the same time, there's going to be trouble, because 1,000 ox carts requires a lot of food for the ox and water, and when they get to the other place, maybe there'll be a bit of competition over the price and the selling of the goods. So the Buddha, or in that life they called him a bodhisattva. The bodhisattva had to think what's the best thing to do, and he thought, well, we should go at different times would be better. So out of compassion he went to the other merchant and said, oh, you've got a lot of stuff to sell there. If we both go at the same time, maybe it's not the best. So would you like to go first or after? So he gave him a choice. And the other merchant thought it through and thought, oh, well, if I go first, then the way there through the wilderness, I'll be able to use the whatever grass and vegetation is there, my oxen can eat it. And when I get to the other city, I'll be the first merchant to arrive, so I'll be able to set the price and sell all my stuff and get all the profits and get home again. So perhaps his greed was leading him, didn't think things through so well, so he said, yeah, I'll go first. So the Buddha, the Bodhisattva, went away agreeing that. And the Bodhisattva thought, well, if he goes first, that won't be too bad, because if he goes with his 500 ox carts, then they're going to flatten the road, which is always bumpy, and they'll eat all the old grass, and so that will give time for new grass to grow for my oxen. And when they get to the city, they're going to be haggling for a long time over the price and before they sell their stuff. So when I go afterwards, the price will be set. It'll be easier for me to sell my stuff. So it shouldn't be such a bad deal. So he agreed, I'll go after. And the first merchant went off happily to be on his way to go and make his money, but then going across the wilderness, they had to carry a lot of water in big tubs or pots in their ox carts. It was the heaviest thing they were carrying, because you need so much water because of the desert. There's no water available. But halfway through, travelling through the wilderness, the desert, they encountered some yakas. Yakas are like giants, a class of being the Buddha talked about. And these yakas wanted to eat people. That's how they got their fun, was eating people. So their plan was to eat this group of merchants and all the people in that entourage. But they can't just attack them, they have to have a plan. So their plan was they disguised themselves as another group of merchants and rode on horseback coming in the opposite direction, and they made themselves look very wet and gave themselves muddy boots, and they put wet lotus flowers in their hair and on their horses to decorate. So it gave the impression that they come through somewhere where there's a lot of water. And they started talking to the merchant and his people and said, "Oh, where are you off to? You're going to that city to sell, are you?" And they say, "Yes." And they said, "Oh, you're going to take a long time to get there. You're moving very slowly with all these carts full of water. You really don't need them, because just up ahead there's a really lush rainforest. There's lots of water there, ponds, and you won't need all this water. You'll be able to get it ahead. So why don't you discard your water, then you'll be able to move faster, get to the city, sell your stuff quicker, make your money quicker." And they just believed the fake news from the yakas and said, "Oh, that's a good idea. Let's get rid of all these pots of water. We'll be able to go twice as fast." The yakas went off in another direction because they were just pretending to be not really interested, just compassionate human beings giving some misinformation to naive travellers. So off they went, and the merchant and his entourage went ahead, having dumped their water, and of course they never found any water, so they got more and more thirsty, and the animals got weaker and went slower and slower, and the people got weaker, and they couldn't cook because they didn't have water to cook, and they couldn't travel anymore, so they had to camp, and they're all very weak, so they passed out, and in the middle of the night the yakas came down and killed them all and ate them all, and just left bones and ox carts full of goods to sell, but nobody left to sell them. So a few months later, the Buddha, the Bodhisattva, comes along with his entourage, and the same thing happened. They're halfway through the desert, and they meet the yakas disguised as travellers, and they hear the same story, but the Bodhisattva is wiser because he's trained in wise reflection. So he hears the news of that there's water up ahead and it's all good and they don't need to carry so much water. And he just hears it without agreeing or disagreeing to do anything. He just listens and lets the yakas go on their way. And then he has a talk with his own people. His own people were doubting that the Buddha was thinking of not getting rid of the water and not following the yakas' instructions. But the Buddha said, "Well, have you ever heard of this rainforest where there's ponds and lots of rain and water up ahead? Have you ever heard of that before?" And his people said, "No." And the Buddha said, "Well, have you ever, as we've been traveling, have there been any rain clouds or damp winds coming from that direction?" "No." "So maybe, there maybe is water ahead, but maybe not. We shouldn't just believe the first person who comes along and gives us this kind of information. We should check it out for ourselves. So really we should have a policy, if we haven't found water, we shouldn't discard our water, the water we already have. Play it safe." So everyone agreed. They said, "Well, we'll go slowly." "Well, never mind, we'll go a bit slower, but we'll keep our water." And of course, they never found any rainforest or water, and there was no rain clouds, no rain happened. And when they camped at night, because they were still strong, because they had water and they could cook food, cook their rice, cook their food, they were strong, so every night the Bodhisattva and a few people stayed guard, so the yakas couldn't attack them, so the yakas were frustrated. So in the end they got to the other city and they sold their goods, and they also they'd found these, on the way they found the empty carts with the bones of the other merchants. They realized what had happened, so they collected the most expensive goods because it was just sitting there in the desert, and took that along as well. And so they sold all the stuff and made lots of money. And the Bodhisattva's aim was to obviously make his trade, make money, but also to protect his people. And so he got them all back to Paranasi without a single life being lost. And that is the sort of thing the Bodhisattva would do, life after life. He'd lead people using wisdom to protect them, guide them in different situations. There's a very common kind of scenario in different lifetimes, different stories, but the same sort of thing going on. But the Buddha is pointing out this is how we train in Yoniso Manasikara. You don't just believe what you hear or what you read. You hear some new theory or some new information, you have to consider it first and look at it from different angles and get further information and take your time to ponder it, consider it. Then you're on safe ground. And that works, on many different levels, whether you're talking about, life in the world, the people you meet and the information you get from the news or social media about different aspects of society, or your own mind, your own thoughts, your own moods, reactions to things. When you're meditating, you look at your mind, not every desire you have is helpful or conducive to your happiness, is it? If you follow every desire, it's probably going to lead to disaster. You have to consider with wisdom and reason reflection, this desire that I am currently experiencing, how useful is it for me? Is it for my benefit or for more suffering? Whatever it is, isn't it? Not every kind of food is good for you. So just because you like a food, you shouldn't necessarily eat it, or you should be careful how much you eat. Or people you meet, some people you meet and they want to lead you in ways that are definitely going to cause you trouble and problems. So you shouldn't just follow what they say or follow their habits. Different activities we think of doing, some of them are okay and good for us, some of them are definitely not good for us. If you have a particular addiction, the only way to get through it is to wisely reflect and see the danger of it, the harm that comes from following that addiction until you agree to give it up. So wise reflection is something we use all the time in the practice. It's not just for when you're meditating deep in the forest, it can be when you go to work or when you're dealing with your kids or whatever aspect of life it may be. It's the antidote to just following blindly every thought that comes up, every emotional reaction that comes up. The Buddha actually said you practice wise reflection, it leads you to develop more mindfulness because it makes you heedful and makes you see the value of being more mindful. So wise reflection leads you into the practice of meditation. If you need more incentive to meditate, it's something you need to be motivated to do, then wisely reflect on your life. Look at your mind. What is a mind that is not trained like? Well, it experiences a lot of stress, suffering, fear, boredom, worry. It's a prey to its emotions and negative mind states. When you think that through, then you say, I should train more. I should practice more meditation, develop more mindfulness, more calm, more joy, more happiness, more wholesome states of mind. So wise reflection is like this. It's a tool that we have to develop through the practice. And the Buddha encouraged it at every step. It's not like it's just something you do in the beginning and then you can set it aside and I've reflected well now, I know I should meditate, I should keep precepts. I don't have to think about that anymore. It doesn't work like that, does it? You have to keep coming back to reflecting on whatever the particular problem is in your day, in your life, that's coming up, bothering you. You have to look more deeply. What's going on here? Why am I so stressed? Why am I so unhappy? Why am I not at peace with myself? What's going on? What's the problem with this other person? These kind of issues come up every day, so we have to keep coming back to wise reflection over and over again. Even at the later stages of the practice, the Buddha said, even a Sotapanna, a stream enterer, can become complacent in the practice, become lazy. They can become too content with what they've achieved. So they may have achieved some level of samadhi and understanding, and they have faith in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, and generally they probably feel quite good and are quite content in themselves, but they're not fully enlightened yet. They're a stream enterer. They still have more subtle defilements bothering them. But they may just sit back and say, oh, I've achieved this already, and they give up their practice. And the Buddha said that's because they're lacking yoniso manasikara. So even a noble one still is cultivating yoniso manasikara to see where they're getting stuck, complacent, where they're believing something to be one thing when it's another, thinking. Some people attain some state of samadhi, jhana, and they think this is nibbana. The only way out of that is to develop yoniso manasikara. Teachers can help. Teachers stimulate our own thinking, so listening to the Dhamma, discussing Dhamma, asking questions can help, but they can't actually develop your yoniso manasikara for you. You have to take what you've heard and consider it and learn from your experience. So teachers are important, and listening to what the Buddha said or reading what the Buddha said is vital in the practice, but what you have to do is internalize it and make it your own wisdom. And this is what yoniso manasikara does. You bring in the information you've gained from the talks, the books, but then it becomes something that you're developing through your own experience by examining the truth. Just something as simple as the thought of impermanence, the idea of impermanence. You could say, well, I know that everything is impermanent, but that's just a thought. You have to see and examine your experience to see feelings arising and ceasing, thoughts arising and ceasing, to see the changing nature of this body. The contemplation of anicca, or impermanence, that's an ongoing thing where you're investigating the characteristic of change in your experience. It's not something you can just believe in or think, well, I know that everything is impermanent and that's the end of it. It's something you have to really look at and observe until your mind is trained in that, and then it will be noticing and observing it all the time. So it won't be fooled by the perception of permanence. What covers up impermanence is the view that a certain thing is permanent. So we have desires for permanent kinds of happiness. If once I get that, everything is going to be good and I'm going to be happy. Once I get the job, all is going to be good, all problems will be solved. Once I meet the love of my life, I'll be happy forever and ever. Once the child is born, then my family will be complete. Once I make my first million, it will be all good. But it's not sure, is it? It's impermanent, and this is something you have to look at and investigate. So sometimes nature helps us along the way. Nature throws up an earthquake just to remind you that nothing is permanent in this world. Everything can be toppled by an earthquake. When did you ever consider that your house is not permanent? We usually just take it for granted. You'll be going home at the end of the day and you'll have a house to go into and sleep in, and it's your place. You paid for it, so you've got it. It's in your name. It's your place, and no one can dispute that or take it away from you. But it's not sure. Maybe there'll be an earthquake and it'll all fall down. Your health, you usually take that for granted, don't you? Your health seems something impermanent, it's something permanent. And we kind of develop our worldview about that sense that this body should be healthy, and the way I like it, look like I want it to look, feel like I want it to feel, and everything should be working properly. But it doesn't. Things come along, diseases, pandemics come along to remind us it's not permanent. This body is very fragile, isn't it? Can easily be injured, easily catch disease. And it's aging every day. We always praise someone who looks young for their age, but even the youngest looking person still ages. Eventually they'll look old, eventually they'll die. These are things we have to investigate with wise reflection so that we're not too deluded by the world. It's almost like, our mind is content to be deluded. It's easier just to go along with those views and those opinions on things and those desires. I want things to be permanent, so unless something proves it otherwise, I'll just accept that. It's easier. You buy your new thing, you buy your new car, your new set of clothes. It's only after a while you come to a sort of grudging conclusion, didn't last. The car is broken down or scratched, the clothing is worn out, damaged, the relationship changes, the job changes, everything changes. And this is something we have to teach ourselves, educate ourselves with wise reflection until we really know it and see it. And then there's no suffering because we know the way things are. This is the goal of training in wise reflection, is bringing your mind to see the way things are so that you don't suffer. And there's a purpose to it. If we don't train in this, well, we tend to just go according to the flow of our moods and our emotions and our thoughts and our beliefs, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're true, sometimes they're false. And you see that when you're in seclusion, because your mind pulls you all over the place if you're not careful. If you're on a retreat and you've got many hours to meditate, we say, I am meditating, sitting there or walking, but how many thoughts go through the mind, and how often the mind is just jumping around from idea to idea, not very peaceful at all. Planning and scheming, regretting, dwelling in the past with anger, resentment, hoping for the future. So much of that time is spent thinking aimlessly, letting your mind wander all around the universe. We have to train it not to do that. We have to train it in wise reflection. Train it in mindfulness, train it in wise reflection. This is what the noble ones have done, this is what the Buddha has done. It's the way out of suffering. So maybe I'll leave you with those reflections tonight, and I wish you all well.